All right, we are going to start talking about UV editing. Going to go kind of step by step, starting with fairly simple and moving to more complex UV. So let me just start by explaining it a little bit. So UV editing is basically projecting a two-dimensional image onto a 3D model's surface. So imagine like paper wrapped around a box, or a label wrapped around a soda can, or something like that. It's a way to unfold or unwrap any kind of texture, photograph, drawing, painting, anything like that, and put it onto a 3D surface. So to accurately do that, you have to create a two-dimensional map of that surface. And one thing you can think of as an example is like the Earth. So you got Earth. Right, so you got all these different ways of projecting it. Basically a 3D surface, there's different ways that the Earth gets projected. And they all have their advantages and disadvantages. All right, so let's dive in. So the first thing to do is to start with the default cube, our very exciting default cube, and you're going to go to the top of the screen here where you've got your layout, modeling, sculpting, and you're going to click on the one that says UV editing. And UV just simply stands, it's just two letters to differentiate it from XYZ, which is three-dimensional coordinates, X, Y, and Z axes, and UV axes are two-dimensional axes. And so right away when you do this, you will get a split screen that shows your model on the right. You'll automatically be in edit mode, and on the left you'll see a kind of cross-looking model, or a cross-looking shape that basically is the default way that Blender is going to unwrap your cube. Okay, so for our first demo, we're going to go with this default, and then we're going to work our way into a little bit more complicated way of understanding it. So what you can do to kind of start getting this is if you go into face mode and you click on a face, on the left it's going to correspond with which face that is as the UV map. And a better way of kind of getting an idea of this is if you go into the UV editor window, at the very top left, you can hover over this for a moment. It says UV sync selection. It's these two little bypassing arrows. Click on that, and that will highlight the whole model mesh, even if it's not selected. This gives you a better idea. So now you can see that in our model, we've got the top happens to be that middle, or the top happens to be that right face, etc. All right, so far so good. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have to learn a little bit of we're going to have to do a little bit of Photoshop work here in order to make this work. So first thing is select your whole cube by hitting A. So the whole thing is selected here, the whole UV, and then at the top of the screen you'll click on the UV button and you'll scroll down to the very bottom where it says export UV layout, and we're going to export that. We're going to export this image here, right here, and we're going to take it into Photoshop. So export UV layout. I'm going to go onto my desktop and I'm just going to call this, just so for now, I'm going to call this cube UV layout, and it's a PNG file, which is good. It's what you want. You're going to go ahead and hit export UV layout to your desktop. All right, so I'm going to go into steps here. So we're going to go to Photoshop. I'm going to open up Photoshop now, or any image editing software. Hopefully, if you don't have Photoshop, you can find some free version of this software. And I'm going to open up that file. Okay, so I've got now my UV layout, and in Photoshop, you know, not going to spend a lot of time explaining Photoshop, but basically if you have your layers showing, you'll see that this is simply a layer on top of a transparent grid. So in order to demonstrate how the UV map works, we're going to create a new layer, layer 2 here, and I'm just going to simply, with a paintbrush tool, I'm going to hit B on my keyboard and go into paintbrush tool and click this little icon here, which gives me the ability to select a color. I'm going to just do a few huge brush. Nope. I'm going to do a few markings in these different areas. So I'm going to draw a little red circle here, and maybe a mark here, and just do something different on every section. So that we can look at what this map looks like when we go into Blender. Just follow along with all the steps, because it is important to not miss one of these important steps. So, all right, so I've got this. Basically what I've done is I've created 6 different sides, or 6 different images for each side of my cube, right? So this is a kind of unfolded box. So before I take it back into Blender, super important is that right now 2 layers are showing. You've got the layer that you just drew, and you've got this underlying layer, which is kind of just the outline to show you where the map is. You have to turn this layer off, because when you import this image back into Blender, it will show this gray box and the outline, which is not what we want. What we want is simply that to be used as a guide. Turn it off and then export this. So I'm going to say File, and I'm going to say Save As. I'm going to turn this into a JPEG by selecting the how to save as type JPEG, and I'm going to call it something different, UV cube, or cube cube painting, cube painting, sure, why not, onto the desktop, JPEG, and hit save. All right, so gone into Photoshop, created this image, and I'm going to go back into Blender, and now the fun part where we assign a material to this object, and we assign that image texture that we just made, and it will correspond very nicely with the map that Blender created for us. So in order to do that, we're going to go back into object mode. So we're now, our UVs disappear, but we're in object mode, and this all should be review. But to create a new material, you're going to click on your materials properties button on the right, and it gives you a new surface, which is white. And remember that in order to see any materials you add, you need to hover into the screen, hit Z, and go into material preview. Okay, so now we see that we have a white color, right? So if I make it a green color, you'll see it. Okay, so we're going to ignore that color, and instead we're going to override that with the image that we just made. So the little circle to the right of the base color, you're going to click on that, choose image texture. Okay, so the thing turns black, and that's correct. That's just saying that it doesn't have anything attached to it. Right underneath image texture, you've got the ability to hit new or open. So we're going to select open, and we are going to find our cube painting and hit open. And voila, we've got all 6 sides on the cube. Now if I tab, I'm going to see, oops, that it corresponds with our cube. Right? So if we go back to Photoshop, we'll see that it does the same thing. So you've got this thing mapped out exactly the same way as in Blender. So here you just notice that we've got, if you go to your different faces, so the important thing to understand about the way UV maps work and the way that the objects works is if I go into vertex mode, for instance, and I click on this vertex in the scene and I grab it, you know, I'm changing the model shape, but the UV is sort of stretching along with it because it's keeping its place. However, if I go into the UV section and I grab a vertex, so I box select this vertex and I hit G to grab it. Now notice that when I do that, the UVs change. These are all the same corner changing, but the model doesn't change. So this is just a different way of understanding the way that the map works. So if I, let's see, 3. Right, so if I grab this face and move it, you know, I can move it into a white area and it's just going to be blank. I could actually also do, you know, move it overlapping this green and I create 2 faces that are green or 2 faces that are purple or whatever, right? So that's how the UV map works. You can grab the faces independently, you can grab vertices independently, and it's different than modeling. Okay, so the basic default way of UV mapping is kind of done like that. In the next step, we're going to create our own UV map, create our own custom one, and look at the difference of it, and do some more mapping of a kind of photographic looking image. I think we'll stop the video there.